Christian child education. Luke chapter 23 verses 26 through 31. As the soldiers led him away, they seized Simon from Cyrene, who was on his way in from the country, and put the cross on him and made him carry it behind Jesus. A large number of people followed him, including women who mourned and wailed for him. Jesus turned and said to them, "Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me, weep for yourselves and for your children. For the time will come when you will say, 'Blessed are the childless women, the wombs that never bore and the breasts that never nursed.' Then they will say to the mountains, 'Fall on us,' and to the hills, 'Cover us.' For if people do these things when the tree is green, what will happen when it is dry?" Summary. Christians must always contemplate injustice in the presence of God. It is an injustice to distance oneself from God. The unjust reality of distancing ourselves from God should not extend to our children. We cannot lead our children down the path of collective destruction with our own hands. Jesus was arrested in Gethsemane and was interrogated and dragged around all night, enduring ridicule and whipping, before eventually receiving a crucifixion sentence from Pontius Pilate. The main text describes an incident that occurred while Jesus was carrying the cross to Golgotha, the crucifixion site. Jesus, exhausted from the overnight interrogation, kept falling while carrying the cross on the way to the execution site. Eventually, an officer escorting Jesus to the crucifixion forced a bystander, Simon of Cyrene, to carry Jesus' cross instead. Then Jesus saw the women who were following him, beating their chests and weeping in sorrow. The content of what Jesus said to them is found in the main text. We have to overcome the 3 hurdles set up by the main text. As we overcome each hurdle in turn, we will be able to hear what the main text says to us. The first hurdle. The first hurdle is verse 28. Jesus turned and said to them, "Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me, weep for yourselves and for your children." This passage draws out an agreement in the depths of our hearts. Why did Jesus tell the women who were weeping and beating their breasts? Seeing him carrying the cross, "Do not weep for me, weep for yourselves and your children." This statement contains Jesus' stern judgment not only for the women but also for the generations that come and go. Jesus judges that they have, in fact, failed in teaching their children. The Jewish home education is famous, and books and lectures that introduce their home education methods are still popular today. In their education system, not only families, but also the children's communities play an important role. The whole village participates in raising children, which is the Jewish educational system. The place where they fostered children was the synagogue, and at the top of the synagogue was the temple. However, the high priests, the Pharisees, and the Sadducees who were running the synagogues and temples agreed to sentence Jesus. To them, the guilt or innocence of Jesus did not matter. Jesus, who saw through all these facts, told them that their children were watching the injustice of their parents' generation in nailing an innocent person to the cross. So, it is Jesus' stern evaluation of the synagogues and temples of the time, and even the whole society of Israel. Jesus judged that they vividly taught their children how to falsely accuse an innocent person and push them to death through their lives. So, Jesus lamented that they should not weep for him, but weep for their children who will live according to the education they received. If we compare verse 28 where Jesus lamented, and the saying, "If they do these things in a green tree, what shall be done in the dry?" Luke chapter 23 verse 31, the green tree symbolizes our children, and the dry tree symbolizes us. Jesus' judgment is that the green tree has learned all the wrongdoings of the dry tree. So, Jesus sternly evaluates that it is natural to shed tears for themselves, and they should lament and wail above their hearts for their children. The second hurdle. The second hurdle is verse 29, "Behold, the day will come when people will say, 'Blessed are the childless women, the wombs that never bore and the breasts that never nursed.'" Why would Jesus say that on the day of judgment, those who could not conceive, wombs that did not give birth, and breasts that did not nurse are blessed? The day, behold, the day will come, refers to the day God makes us, the dry trees, and our children. The green trees hear the trumpet of destiny and judgment, which is the day of tribulation. Originally, conception was a sign of receiving a blessing. In particular, the significance was even more profound in times when children were considered wealth. However, Jesus speaks of a reversal of meaning, saying that on the day of God's judgment, conception is a curse rather than a blessing. The reason why Jesus speaks like this is because God's judgment is strict. There is no way God would pass judgment lightly. On that day, we can't help but groan that the womb that did not give birth is blessed. The tribulation of that day is so severe that it makes us groan. Jesus describes the scene where we, the dry trees, beat our chests in regret on that day. It's a lament for us to beat our chests in the time of tribulation, saying, "Why did we produce unjust children? How did we bring our children to this point?" It's a lament of regretting while beating our chests, saying, "If only we had no children, wouldn't the judgment be only for us?" This is the lament we realize when the day of tribulation arrives. It is our cry that not only is it natural for us who committed injustice to receive judgment, but we also cannot help but see our children, who did not learn about God, did not know what faith is, did not receive instruction on what the church is, and how to live as believers in society, receiving judgment and tribulations. Let us engrave in our minds the words, "Behold, the day will come when people will say, Blessed are the childless women, the wombs that never bore, and the breasts that never nursed." Verse 29. Let us ensure that conception becomes a blessing instead of a curse on the day of God. The third hurdle. The third hurdle to overcome is verse 30. At that time, people will say to the mountains, "Fall on us," and to the hills, "Cover us." Jesus quoted these words from Hosea chapter 108. Israel's guilt, even the mountaintops of Avayan, will be destroyed, and thistles and thorns will grow on their altars. Then they will say to the mountains, "Cover us," and to the hills, "Fall on us." Avayan's altars do not refer to a specific region's shrines but rather to people who commit injustice. To put it simply, worshipping idols is considered an abomination and a curse by God. God warns about idolatry so much because it represents turning away from God and severing the relationship with Him. The individuals referred to as Avayan's mountaintops by Hosea the prophet are the whole of Israel. In Luke chapter 23, the Avayan's mountaintops that Jesus lamented and looked upon were the generation of dry trees, nailing Him to the cross, and their children, the green trees. Even today, the mountaintops of Avayan still exist. Are we not committing injustices before God and our children? As if passing on a genetic legacy, we accurately teach our children to distance themselves from God without any error. The unjust people will cry out for the mountains to cover them and the hills to fall on them. What does this mean? On that day, God's stern judgment will pierce our hearts and marrow. When the last trumpet sounds, and God will speak about the right and wrong each person has done, the warnings of God, which were so neglected, will penetrate our hearts and marrow. On that day, we can only cry out for the mountains to cover us and the hills to fall on us. Christian child education. Jesus has judged that you have not only ruined your own education but also that of your children. However, Jesus invites us to sit by His side instead of sitting in a place of injustice. Although it is a place of suffering and carrying a cross, that place is also one of resurrection and life. The injustice referred to in Hosea, cited by Jesus, has a much more serious meaning than what our common sense and laws tell us. Christians should always ponder injustice before God. To distance oneself from God is injustice. According to Psalm chapter 1, for our children to become trees planted by the riverside, we must teach them to delight in the law of the Lord and meditate on it day and night. Teach them properly and correctly. A Christian does not confess their faith only in church. The faith of a Christian is revealed in every aspect of daily life. There is no need to say that this is the very place where our children's education takes place. The unjust practice of distancing oneself from God, which is ingrained in our lives, cannot be passed down to our children. We cannot hold our children's hands and lead them on the path of destruction. We must remember Jesus' words, "Do not weep for me, but weep for yourselves and your children." There is still an opportunity to do so when we think about these words. Amen.